All right. Hopefully you all had a good weekend. Anything exciting happen? It used to be that I would start class saying, anybody get arrested? Because I always check the police block. But we can't even have enough fun to get arrested anymore, right? I mean, that's one of the worst things about COVID. We can't get into any real trouble anymore. So, but anyway, hopefully you had a good weekend. Hopefully we spent a little bit of time relaxing, enjoyed a little bit of the weather. Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be pretty nice, right? Things are shaping up nicely for our spring break beginning next week. So yeah, anyway, hope that gives us a little bit of energy here for this week, because we are definitely on the downslope of the class, right? Now we're in the third week. You guys have been through the block plan enough. You know how this starts to work, right? Where things start to, well, we're on the downslope, right? That also means that we kind of pick up some speed. And so this will feel like, I think, a pretty busy week with quiz number 4 tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then, you know, the big thing this week is exam number 2 on Thursday, okay? And so, yeah, so this will be a busy week and an important week. So we'll begin working on that stuff. So, so any questions about anything about the class or where we're headed? So today we're going to talk about fiscal policy, right? Oh yeah, Brad.
So the things that we learned today, are they going to be on the quiz tomorrow?
Yeah, so the quiz tomorrow will be on chapter 12, which is really what we talked about last Thursday and Friday, aggregate and aggregate supply, and chapter 13, which is what we talked about today on fiscal policy, right? So chapter 12 and 13 will be in the quiz. And it'll be the same, you know, the same drill that we've been doing. We'll take it at the end of class tomorrow. We'll have a little bit of time to review. That will be the drill. Okay, so yeah, so on tomorrow's quiz is chapter 13, and that's really going to be the focus of what we talk about today. And so we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy. So I think today's lecture is actually pretty interesting, right? Particularly for those of you who have an interest in government and public policy. There's a lot, I would say, kind of a lot of either bad information or misinformation about how fiscal policy works. And so we want to kind of talk about that today. So we're going to talk about a little bit of theory, but you know, we're also going to talk about a lot of kind of just factual details about the way that the U.S. government works in regards to fiscal policy. So that's where we will turn to now. Assuming this works, because it'll be working in a minute. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 13 on fiscal policy. So what do we mean here when we talk about fiscal policy? Well, we're really talking about government activities in the economy to a large extent. So we are talking about government spending and government purchases. What's the difference between these two? What's the difference between government spending and government purchases? We talked about this before. Yeah.
Is government purchase like the actual act of buying something that you're spending might be putting it into something and having that thing that they're putting it into, I guess, do the spending, versus like, for example, like maybe giving money to like schools or to people, that's like spending.
That is spending, right? Because what is government spending? It's government purchases plus government transfer payments. So we could actually, maybe a better way to write this is government purchases plus government transfer payments. So government purchases are the purchase of goods and services by the government. When the government's built a road, that is government purchases. When the government sends your grandma a check for her Social Security, that's government transfer payments. Add it all together, that's government spending. Okay, so we're going to be talking about this distinction, and we're going to be talking about how these things look. We're going to talk about taxes, and talk a little bit about tax policy and where taxes come from. And then, importantly, we'll talk about deficits and the debt. What's the difference between the deficit and the debt? What's the difference between the deficit and the debt? I tell we all did our readings over the weekend. What's the difference between the deficit and the debt? Someone's going to have to give me a guess. We really don't know the difference between the deficit and the debt. I mean, this isn't an economics question. This is a reading the newspaper and understanding the world question. What's the difference between the deficit and the debt? Yeah.
The deficit by year and the debt is total.
Exactly. The deficit is the yearly borrowing. And what's the debt? Total accumulated borrowing. So if our deficit last year, well, let's go back 2 years ago. We still don't know what our deficit last year was quite. But our deficit in 2019 was $1 trillion. Our debt, meaning our total accumulated borrowing, was about $22 trillion, right? About $22 trillion. So we need to talk about how all these things are related to each other. And basically what fiscal policy has in common is it's related to government budgets, right? When we talk about the government budget, we have to talk about these issues of government spending, taxes, deficits, and debt. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about the facts of them, and then also kind of tell us what does economic theory say about how government should manage their spending, their taxes, and particularly, we want to talk about these deficits and debts, right? And how should governments manage these deficits and their debts? Let's begin by just kind of looking at some factual information about the U.S. Budget. So, first graph I want to show you here is just looking at government spending. Okay, and this is government spending, remember, not purchases, government spending. Government spending as a percent of GDP. So you see in the United States that our government spending is about 35% of GDP, right? Now that's not a perfect way to think about it, because remember, there's a lot that goes into government spending that is not included in GDP, right? There's a lot that goes into government spending that's not included in GDP. But this, just to give you some rough size of how much our spending is, it's about 35%. About 20% is government purchases, and about 16% is transfer payments, right? And you can see where this compares to other countries. I'm sorry, the darker green line is government revenue, right? That's total government revenue. And so the difference between these is the yearly deficit, right? So the US has a deficit of a little bit over 4% of GDP, right? Which is a relatively big number. If you look at other countries, you see a couple of differences. First off, the US has a relatively small government relative to these other rich countries of Japan, Canada, and France, right? That the US is lower both in terms of tax revenue and in terms of government spending. And the US has a relatively big deficit, right? As a percent of GDP, we really have the biggest deficit, the biggest difference between government spending and tax revenue. Let's talk first here about tax revenue. How does the government collect taxes? The government relies heavily on income taxes, right? The US government relies heavily on income taxes, specifically your personal income tax, okay, which is what we file every April, right? Corporate income taxes, and then also your Social Security tax, right? So the Social Security tax is really pulled out of your paycheck every month, right? And that's the money that goes to pay for Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, right? So you see here that the vast majority, right, and even some of these other taxes are tied to income too. The vast majority of the revenue that the US collects is tied to income taxes. That's not true for most other countries. Most other countries rely much more heavily on spending taxes through things like consumption taxes, or we talked about a VAT tax, a value-added tax. So if you go to Canada, Canadians do pay an income tax, but it's relatively small. Most Canadians pay taxes through a VAT tax, which is essentially a tax that's put into the price of the goods that you buy. And so we talked about this in chapter 10 when we talked about how this changes the incentives to save and spend in the US, right? That Americans really have less incentive to save than in other countries because of the way that we tax income. We don't tax spending. So that's just kind of a rough breakdown of how the US collects tax revenue. How about spending? Spending's a little bit more complicated here. Let's just kind of go around the wheel. Medicare, Medicaid, and the American Obamacare, 20%, right? A big chunk of the US budget is spent on healthcare. Then we have other goods and services. This would be things like education, roads, bridges, Social Security. These are your grandma's paychecks. Education, sorry, I said education in here, but it's actually broken out. National defense, and then other government transfer payments. This would be things like unemployment benefits, food stamps, these kind of things. And then finally, interest payments on the debt, right? That amount that we have borrowed is in bonds, and those bonds have to be paid for. And so we spend about 12% of all of our spending just paying interest on the debt. This is only the federal government. This is not looking at state and local governments, right? So this is only the federal government. There's a couple of things to be gleaned here. And I think maybe the most important thing is the fallacy that a lot of people try to tell you, which is that we could somehow balance our budget, our government budget, without raising taxes and only by cutting government spending. Okay? That's really a fallacy, because when people talk about government spending, they usually say, well, we're going to cut government spending, but we're not going to touch your Medicare, we're not going to touch Social Security, and we won't touch national defense. Well, if you don't touch Medicare, and you don't touch Social Security, and you don't touch national defense, and you can't change the interest payments, how much is left? Not much. Not much, right? And a lot of the stuff that's in this is very popular too, like roads and bridges, right? So this idea that somehow there's all this waste in government, and that we can balance the budget but not touch, Social Security, Medicare, and national defense. Well, I mean, the numbers just don't add up, right? The numbers just don't add up. About 60% of this budget now is transfer payments. Okay, so the government, only about 40% of government spending is actually purchasing goods and services. A lot of it is transfer payments, particularly Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And we'll come back and talk about these. These are a challenge, particularly this one, right? Social Security is actually relatively decent shape. A few common sense common sense tweaks would fix Social Security. The problem with Medicare and Medicaid is a much bigger one, right? And so we'll come back and talk about that. But yeah, you know, the government is increasingly becoming a function for moving money around, right? And providing goods and services is not as big a function of what they used to be, what they do. How should government budgets be run? So after that quick overview, let's just talk a little bit as a way to kind of go back and review what we talked about last week. How should fiscal policy be run according to Keynes? Okay, how should fiscal policy be run according to Keynes? Well, Keynes had a big idea in the general theory, and that was fiscal policy should be run according to the principles of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Or to put it another way, what should fiscal policy be doing? It should be leaning against the wind. Whatever the momentum in the economy is, fiscal policy should be trying to offset that momentum. Okay? So why are we calling counter-cyclical? Because whatever the business cycle is doing, fiscal policy should be trying to push back against that. Okay? So let's think about a recession. Where we have a fall in aggregate demand and output falls below the natural rate. What should the policy be? The policy, as we talked about last week, should be to increase aggregate demand. And how do you do that? By spending more and taxing less. And how do you pay for it? By running a deficit, right? That's the idea behind Keynesian counter-cyclical stabilization policy, right? So think back to this graph that we worked through last Friday. Okay, so we have a fall in aggregate demand. Our output is below the natural rate. What should the government do? The government should spend more, it should tax less, and it should run a deficit. Why? Because that will increase aggregate demand. and it will increase output back towards the natural rate. Okay? This is really what we talked about last week, right? What do we call this? Stimulus. This is stimulus, right? This is stimulus. Right? Fiscal stimulus. And this is exactly what's being talked about in Congress right now, right? President Biden is pushing forward this big $2 trillion plan. And in it is chock full of fiscal stimulus to try to stimulate aggregate demand. Fiscal stimulus in the form of checks to families that have kids. Fiscal stimulus in the form of spending more on materials that keep schools open. Fiscal stimulus on spending more to try to get vaccines out. Spending more on research and development to try to track variants of the vaccine, right? As we have more variants, how do we track them and evolve our future vaccines to meet that, right? So lots of money to state and local governments so they can continue to provide goods and services, extending unemployment benefits for people who are unemployed, right? The list goes on and on. All of these are forms of fiscal stimulus, right? Trying to increase aggregate demand during a recession to get output back to the natural rate. Okay, this is probably pretty well understood, right? I think, or hopefully this is well understood, right? The public seems to understand this, right? The public seems to understand that one of the roles of government nowadays is when the economy slows down to try to speed it up. Now, there is, though, a flip side to this that Keynes thought was also important. This is the part, though, that the public and politicians don't like as much. The flip side of this is what happens when you have an expansion. What happens if you get to a situation where aggregate demand goes up so much that output begins to rise above the natural rate? So what I'm talking about is what happens, we've been talking about these cases where output falls so that we fall below the natural rate. What happens if output begins to rise above the natural rate? What's the problem with this situation? Inflation, right? The word here is inflation. If we just let inflation start to rise, we know that's costly. That's not going to be good for the financial system. It's not going to be good for the economy in the long run. And so what should fiscal policy be here?
I guess we're making a policy ensure that doesn't end up in inflation, or
Right. So how do we make sure that there's no increase in inflation?
aggregate demand.
We've got to, it's the government's job to reduce aggregate demand, right? So what the government should be doing here is trying to reduce aggregate demand. They should be cutting government spending and raising taxes and cutting their deficit, or in fact, possibly run a surplus. At least in Keynes' mind, what government should be doing is running deficits during bad times and surpluses during good times. So that in the long run, what's your deficit? Zero, right? You have deficits sometimes, but you have surpluses other times. Over the long run, you should be offsetting those. That was really Keynes' idea. So in Keynes' mind, as one chairman of the Federal Reserve said, it was the government's job to take away the punch bowl right when the party gets started, right? Right when the party's starting, and the economy is really starting to grow fast and pressure on inflation is starting to rise, that's when the government essentially hits the brake. And so you can see why this is often referred to as leaning against the wind. The government in policy should be leaning against whatever the force is, right? They should always be turning toward the wind and leaning into it. So if the economy is growing too fast, they hit the brakes. If the economy is growing too slow, they hit the accelerator. Of course, what's one of the things that we've learned here over the last 50, 70 years? Government has gotten pretty good at doing this. Government's gotten pretty good at hitting the accelerator. But what's the problem? They're not so good at hitting the brake, right? And so we have these situations where instead of running surpluses and trying to slow the economy, we just find that the government doesn't do that. The government spends a lot of time just always hitting the accelerator, right? And we'll look at a little bit of data here in a minute that suggests that this is exactly what happened under the Trump administration, right? Where even though the economy was quite good, what did the Trump administration continue to do? They continue to raise government spending, cut taxes, and run a bigger deficit, even though the economy overall was pretty strong before COVID. That's not traditional fiscal policy management like many economists would argue, right? And we'll come back and talk about that here in a minute, because that's definitely one of the things that's contributing to rising deficits over time, right? Is we do run deficits during bad times. The problem is we don't run surpluses during good times, right? And so we don't get that offset. Before we come back and talk about this, I want to talk about why would we think that changing government spending and changing taxes would significantly impact aggregate demand. And this is really, I think, a question we need to spend a little bit of time talking about. And this is the question of fiscal policy multipliers. How big a change in GDP does a change in government spending or a change in taxes create? Right? How big a change in GDP does a change in government spending or a change in taxes create? Let's think about this a little bit. Let's begin by talking about government purchases. Okay, the government purchases multiplier. If government purchases goes up by $1, does output increase more or less than $1? What does your intuition tell you? Max says it's gonna go up by more than $1, right? Yeah, that's good intuition. If we increase government purchases, we will stimulate output by more than $1. Why is that? Quite simply, what happens when new spending occurs in the economy? New spending becomes somebody else's new income. And what do they do with that? They spend it, which creates somebody else's new income. They spend it, which creates somebody else's new income. And so you get a multiplier effect. The change in income will be bigger than the initial change in spending, right? That's what we refer to as a government spending or government purchases multiplier. But let's work this out here a little bit. First off, before we can talk about how big this multiplier is, we have to talk about a concept called the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, this is the fraction of every new dollar in income that is spent. That's what the marginal propensity to consume is. So, I'm walking down the street and I find a $10 bill. And so I'm like, oh, awesome, 10 bucks. I'm going to immediately go out and I spend $8 and I put $2 in the bank to save. What's my marginal propensity to consume? .8, right? I spend 80% of every new dollar of income, and I save 20%. Okay, so that's really what the marginal propensity to consume is, right? It's the fraction of new income that people spend. So let's think about a hypothetical example here. The Navy, in its infinite wisdom, decides they're going to build a naval base here in Mount Vernon. And the cost is $50 billion. Okay, the change in government spending, I should say. The change in government spending is $50 billion. They're going to spend $50 billion on this new naval base. Okay, and let's assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. In other words, when people get new income, they spend 75 cents, they save a quarter. Okay? So, government's going to build this new naval base. They come to Mount Vernon. They hire a bunch of contractors. Those contractors build the naval base, right? What's the change in spending? Well, if the government's going to spend $50 billion on it, how much do they spend? $50 billion. Right? The change in spending was $50 billion. And that becomes somebody's income. Who gets that money? Well, the people who work in Mount Vernon, the contractors, steel companies. I have no idea what goes into building a naval, a naval base in Mount Vernon, but you can imagine all the things that you have to buy, right? All that spending becomes somebody else's income. Now, what do people do with that new income? They spend it, right? Now, will they spend all of it? No, they're going to save some of it, because when people get new income, they save some of it and they spend some of it. How much will they spend? 75 cents, 75% of that new income. So in the second round, you're going to get $37.5 billion in new spending. And that's going to become somebody else's income. Have any of you ever been to a military base? You can see the second round when you go to a military base, right? You got the military base, and then what's always on the outside of the military base? McDonald's, Wendy's, haircut places, shopping malls, right? I mean, that's where the soldiers are coming to spend their money. So businesses start up around the outside of the military base, because when income is generated in the military base, it then gets spent and creates new income outside. What do the people who are running the haircut places do with the new income they have? They spend it. And how much are they going to spend? Once again, 75% of it. So in the next round, they're going to spend this much. And that's going to create this much new income. In the third round. Okay, hopefully I don't have to keep on going here, right? You see the thing. In the end, what was the initial change in G? 50 billion. But what is the change in income? Much bigger than 50 billion. Because when we add this up, what are we going to get? 50 plus 37.5 plus 28.125, on and on down the line. We are going to get a much bigger change in income than we got in the initial government spending. Why? That's the multiplier effect. New spending creates new income, creates new spending, creates new income, right? And so when we have new spending, this gets multiplied within our economy. How big is this multiplier effect? Can we quantify this? So the government purchases multiplier would just be the change in, sorry, wrong. The change in output we get from a change in government purchases. That's what we can think of as the multiplier. How big is the change in output from a change in government purchases? The minimum is just 1. Right? What would the minimum government purchases multiplier be? It would be 1. For instance, if the government gave, let's say if the government paid somebody to do something, and what did the person do with the money? They just put it all in the bank. Right? If people save all the money, you're not going to get a multiplier. This would be the case where you basically people saved every cent, right? And that would be the minimum multiplier. The minimum multiplier means you don't really get a multiplier. That if there's a $1 change in government purchases, there's a $1 change in GDP. what's the maximum multiplier? With a little bit of algebra, you can show that it's equal to this. One over one minus the marginal propensity to consume. All right, so this is a formula, but really you can solve for this with just a little bit of algebra. I won't do it. But it's reasonably straightforward to figure this out. So in our example, what's the MPC? 0.75, right? I'm writing this backwards. So the change in y over the change in g is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.75, or 4. That's how big the multiplier is, 4. So if the change in G was 50 billion, what's going to be the change in Y? 200 billion. We'll change output by 200 billion if we change government purchases by 50 billion. That's the government spending multiplier. Very importantly, though, this is the maximum. This is the maximum. This formula is a maximum because this assumes that basically every penny that people can spend up to the amount of the marginal propensity to consume, they do spend. Okay, so every cent that they can spend up to their marginal propensity to consume, they spend. Where is the multiplier in the real world? It's probably somewhere between these two extremes, right? And we'll talk about this. One of the difficulties of doing fiscal policy in the real world is it's oftentimes very difficult to figure out how big the multiplier is going to be, right? Many times multipliers are unpredictable, and we'll talk about why that is. But there is a multiplier, right? There is a multiplier. We get a change in output that is bigger than the change in government purchases. Why did Keynes, as we talked about last week, why did Keynes really prefer government purchases as his way of stimulating output? Because what happens if the government decides they want to spend, if they want to increase output? If they spend 50 billion, how much of that money gets spent? 50 billion, right? You're going to get a lot of bang for your buck if the government does the spending. You're going to get a bigger multiplier if the government does the spending. To see that, let's talk about another version of the multiplier, the tax multiplier. How much of a change in output do we get from a change in taxes this time? Okay, so once again, let's work through this example, but this time we're going to just make it a little different. Instead of an increase in government spending, we're going to have a tax cut of 50 billion. Okay? So notice here, negative 50. Why negative 50? Because taxes go down, right? So we're cutting taxes by 50 billion. And once again, let's assume that the MPC is 0.75. So let's do this same example that we did before. So the government gives people a tax cut. And by the way, I should be clear. This tax cut, in many ways, is very much like a transfer payment. This is really the same idea. If the government gives people a tax cut, that's very similar to them getting a rebate check, right? A rebate check is essentially another way to get a tax cut. So these are really, in many ways, similar ideas. So let's say the government gives a $50 billion tax cut to everybody, okay? So now they have $50 billion more in their pocket. How much of it do they spend? $75% of it, right? They spend 75% of it. So in the first round, they save some of it and they spend some of it. And what happens to that spending? That spending becomes somebody else's income. And so when it becomes somebody else's income, how much of it becomes their income? Well, all of it becomes their income, but how much of it will they spend? 75% of this. So in the second round, you get this. And in the third round, you get this. And this keeps on going on and on and on. So when we give a tax cut, are we going to get a change in income bigger than the amount of the tax cut? Yeah, there's going to be a multiplier here, right? Once again, there's a tax multiplier. Right, so the tax transfer multiplier is the change in output you get from a change in taxes or a change in transfers, however you want to think about it. You can show that the negative, or I'm sorry, the maximum multiplier, the maximum tax transfer multiplier, I should put that in here. The maximum tax or transfer multiplier is the change in output divided by the change in taxes is equal to the negative MPC over 1 minus MPC. So it looks a little different here. It looks a little bit different than the government purchases multiplier. Why is this different? Well, notice here that it's negative. Why is it negative? Because when you cut taxes, what has to happen to output? Output has to go up, right? So the negative reflects that there's a negative relationship between the change in taxes and the change in output. But notice where before this is 1 over 1 minus MPC, now this is the MPC times 1 over 1 minus MPC. What does that do to the size of this? Here, the multiplier is -3. So if the change in taxes was -50 billion, then the change in output is 150 billion. Which one gave us the bigger change in output? The tax cut or the increase in government purchases? Government purchases. Remember, if we go back to this example, government purchases increased output by 200, changing taxes increased output by 150. Why? Why did we get a bigger multiplier for government spending? What's the difference?
None of that initial 50 billion was saved.
Right. Yeah, that's it. Look at, it's in the first round, right? Look what happened. This is when we increased government spending by 50 billion. How much gets spent in the first round? 50 billion. And how much goes to income? 50 billion. Every penny of it gets spent. But what happens if we just give people a tax cut? Some of that money is going to save. It's going to leak out. And as a result, we're not going to get as big a change in aggregate demand, and we won't get as big a change in output. And so that's the Keynesian argument for government purchases. To really government, Keynesians believe that government spending, government purchases are the best way to stimulate aggregate demand. They're the most reliable way. So, that's, I think, a very important idea to understand, right? Is that government purchases, they probably are the most reliable way to stimulate aggregate demand. That doesn't mean that they're the easiest politically. And as we're going to talk about, there's some other problems with government purchases, but at least this is how traditional Keynesians think about it, right? That you're given, if stimulating output is your really real goal, then using government spending is the way to do it. It's a more effective way to do it. Now, having said all that, I mean, there are those, I don't know what we call them, notes about the multiplier effect. In the real world, the multiplier is probably between 1 and the maximum multiplier that we have from these formulas. I mean, these formulas are simple, right? They're simple. They're kind of a rule of thumb. But most of the evidence, oops, I don't know where that came from. Most of the evidence suggests that, yeah, these max multipliers are not quite, the multipliers in the real world are not quite as big as these maximum multipliers are, but they still exist. Having said that, the size of the multipliers are very difficult to predict. Part of it is just the psychology of what's going on. think we talked about this. There's quite a bit of good economic evidence that suggests that what did most people do with those $600 checks that they got in the summer? They saved them, right? We didn't get that big multiplier effect that I think, policymakers were hoping for. Why? People are scared. And when they're scared, what don't they want to do? Spend money. So you can lead a horse to water, but that's not going to make them drink. The same with, you can give people money, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to spend, right? So yes, some people spent it because they were really at the end of their rope. But if you looked at a lot of middle and upper class people, they basically saved it, right? And so it did not get the big, the big increase in aggregate demand because, fear. Particularly during bad times, fear is a big impediment to spending. And that can really reduce the size of these multipliers. There's also this problem of whether people view it as a temporary thing or a permanent thing. So once again, go back to those $600 stimulus checks that people got in the summer. Did people view that as permanent or temporary? Temporary. Clearly they view that as temporary, a one-time deal. So if it's a one-time deal, how much did $600 really impact your wealth for many people? It's a drop in the bucket, right? It's a drop in the bucket. So if it's that little, is it really going to change your spending patterns? No, no. And so once again, for some people it did. For people who had very little wealth, $600 meant something. But for people who had much more wealth, $600 didn't mean much. This is one reason why I think a lot of economists said, if you're going to, and still believe, that if you're going to go toward the stimulus checks, you should target them much, much more at lower income people. Because giving money to low income people is a much better way to increase spending than giving money to middle or higher income people, because quite honestly, the size of the checks you give them are probably not going to significantly impact their spending patterns. So there's an equity issue, but there's also an economic issue. It's probably not only more fair to give more money to poor people, but it probably also is better economics in terms of the amount that you actually will get spending. And so, this is just another way to say that, economists really struggle oftentimes in predicting the size, right? How much bang you're going to get for the buck. And oftentimes, unfortunately, we don't get as big a bang for the buck as we would like. Another thing to think about with multipliers is that there's often big lags with multipliers. In other words, they just take time to work. So think back to that ridiculous example about building a naval base in Mount Vernon, right? Would that be a good way of trying to stimulate output? Well, first, it's a dumb idea to build a naval base in Mount Vernon, but there's another deeper problem. How long would it take to build a naval base in Mount Vernon? A decade, right? I mean, a lot of government spending, you can't just click your fingers and expect it to start to work, right? The government can't say, okay, let's go build a bridge, go. I mean, you have to do some planning. You have to, hire contractors. You have to do the architectural work, right? All of this stuff takes time, right? It takes time to plan. And the multiplier itself. It it takes time for the spending to work its way through the economy. So once again, you might say we're going to enact stimulus today, but when is it really going to start to kick in? Probably not for a while. And we definitely saw that during 2008 with the Obama stimulus package, right? That Obama came into office in 2009 and immediately passed a big stimulus package. But when did most of that money get spent? Late 2010 and into 2011, right? It was almost a year before a lot of that money got spent. And so by that time, the economy was already beginning to recover a little bit. You know, I mean, this is just a logistical problem, right? It's a lot easier to do this stuff up here on a screen than it is to do this in the real world, where there's lots of complications in doing this. Having said that, there is one type of fiscal policy, though, that does tend to work pretty well. And this is automatic stabilizers. Okay, automatic stabilizers are changes in government spending and taxes that take place automatically as GDP rises and falls. These are changes in government spending and taxes that take place automatically as GDP rises and falls. So not everything necessarily has to go through the budgeting process in Congress, right? Because some programs are essentially set up to adjust their spending priorities automatically as more people qualify for them or fewer people qualify for them. The classic example of this is unemployment benefits. Or welfare, or Medicaid, or food stamps. In other words, there's a lot of different parts of what we call the social safety net. Related to this is tax cuts. Why do people get a tax cut when they lose their job? Because when you lose your job, what do you also lose? Your income. And we tend to pay income, tend to pay taxes related to our income, right? So I don't want to say this is a good reason to lose your job, but one of the nice side effects of losing your job is you do get a tax cut, right? These things take place automatically. That's the key. That this stuff kicks in automatically. When the economy starts to slow down, people who lose their job can get benefits, they can get welfare, Medicaid, food stamps, and they get a tax cut. Because when their income goes down, they don't have to pay as much. What do these things tend to do? They tend to stimulate the economy. These things do tend to stimulate the economy during downturns. So, think about an example, COVID strikes, right? Last March. GDP starts to go down. But without the president or Congress changing policy at all, right? No policy had to change, but spending and tax revenue began to change, right? Without any change in policy. Why? Because you had more people that were getting unemployment benefits. More people qualified. More people qualified for food stamps. Welfare. And tax revenue went down. So you see these things increase G, and that cut taxes. And automatically, if I can draw this here, the deficit went up automatically. Right? Whenever the economy slows down, you're going to see the deficit go up because there's more spending on food stamps, unemployment benefit, welfare, et cetera. And we get less tax revenue. But the good thing about this is that does push up aggregate demand at least a little and increase GDP a little. Not enough to get probably GDP back to where it was, but to offset some of it. And that's why we call this an automatic stabilizer. It automatically helps to stabilize. And this is something that takes place relatively quickly within the economy, right? As soon as people start losing jobs, as soon as they start losing income, they do get these benefits. And so having a social safety net is important for people. Right? I mean, we don't want people to starve or not have food or not make their mortgages, so they have to default on their payments and put their bank in trouble. Social safety nets are important for people, but it's also important to step back and see there's a macroeconomic consequence to them too, right? That social safety nets help stabilize the aggregate economy. And it takes place automatically, right? This takes place pretty fast. The best thing takes place with very little lags, which is really a strength of these programs. So unlike building a bridge, or building a road, this stuff can take place pretty fast, right? And so, automatic stabilizers, I think, are a very important part of why our economy is relatively more stable than it used to be, right? I mean, most of these programs were implemented during the 50s and 60s, right? And one of the things we've seen since then is that we've had more macro stability. And almost certainly, in part, it's because of this, right? It's because fiscal policy now takes place in many ways automatically, right? You get an automatic response when the economy starts to slow down. Okay, let's talk. There's one other thing that we should mention though when we talk about. Well, actually, let's save that for later. Let's save that for later. Okay, let's move on to talking about deficits and debt. Because this is the flip side of the coin, right? We've been talking about government spending and taxes, but we haven't really talked about how we pay for it, right? Particularly when those two things are not in balance, how do we pay for it? So remember, our yearly budget deficit is just the difference between government spending and our tax revenue. And remember what goes into government spending? Government purchases. And government transfer payments. And notice that the deficit is yearly, okay? Meaning, basically year by year, right? Year by year. Often, we, as economists, we like to think about deficits as a percent of GDP. In other words, to put them in some context. As the deficit, what we would call the deficit to GDP ratio. It's a way to kind of put these, because we're talking about big numbers here, right? To put them in some sort of relative scale. And listen, we do this for individuals too, right? If somebody told you they owe $50,000, what should be the next question out of your mouth? What's your yearly income? If you earn $1 million a year, owing $50,000 is a drop in the bucket. If you earn $20,000 a year, owing $50,000 is a big problem, right? So it's kind of the same with governments too, right? Really, a big deficit really only matters in relation to the size of the overall economy. And so that's how we usually think about this. So I will kind of express some dollar figures here as we go along, but that's how we usually think about it. So let's just look at some data. This isn't the most recent data, in part because, what's going on right now with our budget deficit is a bit crazy. So the first line here is looking at our budget deficit as a percent of GDP from back in 1964 to up to 2019, okay? And so what have we seen? Over the long haul, the government has tended to average, well, first off, we have had periods of surplus. In fact, the last big period of surplus we had was in the late 90s under Bill Clinton, where the government actually collected more money in revenue than they spent right? But since the 2000s, we kind of had this sea change when it comes to deficits, right? Much bigger deficits as a percent of GDP. We see particularly this big spike in 2008 associated with the global financial crisis, right? So the deficit in 2008 was more than 10% of GDP in a single year. And what's going to be true about 2020? We're probably going to be up there again, right? When the final data comes out for 2020, we will probably have had a deficit last year of more than 10% of GDP. What drives these deficits? Well, clearly one of the things that drives these deficits is recessions, for the reasons we talked about. What tends to happen when the economy goes into a recession? Tax revenue goes down, and our spending on the social safety net goes up, the deficit goes up. And so if you see these gray areas, these are recession years. You can see the deficit goes up in each one of these deficit years, right? Or maybe even a more clear relationship to see is, look at the correlation between the budget deficit, which is in the red line, and the unemployment rate, which is the orange line, right? A big part of what drives budget deficits is recessions, right? Budget deficits are what we call pro-cyclical. They move with the economy, right? So Yeah, so in other words, when output falls, the budget deficit tends to go up. When output goes up, the budget deficit tends to go down, right? Tends to go down. So that's definitely one of the things that's been driving higher deficits here, both in 2008 and currently, right? Currently, clearly, COVID is playing a huge role in driving budget deficits. That's not it, though. As we're going to talk about, there's other factors. For instance, look what happened here between 2016 and 2020. Those were not recession years, and yet what was happening to the budget deficit? It was going up, right? It was going up. And so what does that suggest? That budget deficit wasn't driven by the recession. That deficit was driven by purposeful policy choices, right? Purposeful policy choices. In fact, you can see some of these policy choices if you just back up a step. Look what happened here during Trump's time in office. The unemployment rate went down significantly. The quits rate is basically the rate at which people are quitting their job. And maybe this is counterintuitive, but a high quits rate actually is a sign of a healthy economy. Because the more people are quitting the job, the more it's telling you that people think they're going to find another job pretty quickly. So the quits rate went way up, the unemployment rate went way down, sign of a very healthy economy, and yet what was happening to our budget deficit? Going up, right? Not a good sign, right? Not a great sign. It's certainly not what Keynes would tell you, right? Ordinarily Keynes would say we run a surplus or we cut our deficit during good times. We wouldn't raise it. Do balanced budget amendments make sense? Most economists would say no. And the simple reason is it would turn fiscal policy from an automatic stabilizer into an automatic destabilizer, right? So if we had a balanced budget amendment, I can't say that today. If we had a balanced budget amendment, it would mean that what would the government have to be doing right now? It would have to be cutting spending and raising taxes right at the least opportune point in time. Many states and local governments do have balanced budget amendments, and it's not good, right? Here, this is actually looking at the number of employees that were working in the government, state and local governments. And look at that decline in the number of employees during the global financial crisis, right? Many state and local governments were forced to lay off workers because they had balanced budget amendments. They could not borrow the money. And the same thing is happening right now, right? I think I told you in the stimulus, a lot of the stimulus is going to state and local governments. Why? So that they don't have to just lay off a bunch of workers, right? So most economists do not believe that balanced budget amendments make a lot of sense. But that said, right, many politicians have a hard time of really keeping themselves constrained, right? Because it's very easy to spend more and cut taxes. That's the deficit. Okay, that's the deficit, our amount of yearly borrowing. What about our accumulated borrowing? That's the government debt, right? In 2019, our government debt was about $22 trillion, right? About $22 trillion. Once again, usually we think about debt relative to the size of GDP. So our debt ratio in the US is getting pretty close to 100%, right? At 100%. In other words, we owe about 1 year's worth of GDP, right? We owe about 1 year's worth of GDP. If you want to look at the deficit over time, here's the deficit, right? That's fluctuated around 2 to 10%. If you look at the debt, you see that basically since the 2000s, debt has been rising. And as I said, we're getting very close to the point where debt is going to be about 100% of GDP, right? So we'll basically owe 1 year's worth of GDP. How does the US compare to other countries? Well, here we have Greece that has a debt to GDP ratio of about 176%, Japan of 150%, Italy of 120. The US looks really, I mean, ours is higher now, right? Because ours is going to go up a lot because of COVID. Actually, all these countries are going to go up a lot. So yeah, you're right. I mean, the US, while we have a relatively high level of debt, we don't necessarily look like an outlier either among rich countries. What's going on in Norway? Well, you know, Norwegians are very lucky. In part, in part because they have the good fortune of sitting on a huge reserve of oil, one of the world's largest reserves of oil, but also because Norwegians tend to listen to economists. And economists say, instead of just taking all that money and buying toys, why don't you save it? And so Norway has one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. It's basically an investment fund. And the returns from that fund actually get paid to Norwegian citizens every year. Right? So Norwegians, instead of really paying taxes, they get a nice big check in the mail. It's good to be Norwegian. It's also good to be Alaskan, right? Because you may or may not know this, but Alaskans get the same deal. Alaska has a sovereign wealth fund. And I think what the average Alaskan gets like a $2,000 check every year from their state government. So yeah, you know, and that's actually what you would call prudent financial management by these governments. That's not to say, I want to be clear here, the fact that you borrow money doesn't mean that you're not managing your economy, right? The question is, what are the costs of borrowing money and what are the benefits of it, right? That's what you really have to deal with. The benefits are a little bit harder for us to talk about in this class because we don't know exactly how all these countries are spending their money. But we can talk about the debt, the dangers of deficits and debt, and that's where we're going to move here in a second. Who owns all this debt? Like for the US, these $22 trillion. Who owns that?
Other countries?
Other countries, a little bit. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is largely owned by US citizens, right? Who save. They buy government bonds as a way to save. Or when you invest in a mutual fund, you're buying government bonds as a way to save. So the most recent evidence, or the most recent data, is about half of this debt is owned by US citizens. About 30% is owned by foreigners. Sometimes foreign governments, but honestly, in general, not foreign governments. It's just foreign individuals, right? I mean, particularly here I have China and Germany. Why? Because China and Germany are big savers. So these countries conduct a lot of savings. That savings, some of it, they want to save in international assets like US government bonds. And so a lot of our debt is held by foreigners, but that, you know, I think some people want to infer something nefarious from that. No, I mean, they want to save, right? And US government bonds look like attractive ways for them to save. Some of this also is held by governments. We're going to talk about why that is. Interestingly enough, 20% of all our debt is held by the US government. Why is the US government holding our debt? Interesting question. Well, I'll tell you the little secret. Part of the secret is Social Security. That many years Social Security has been in surplus, meaning they've taken in more tax revenue than they spent. And what did they do with the difference? They bought US government bonds. So it's kind of weird to think about, because Social Security is part of the US government, right? It is a bit of an accounting trick where the left hand is borrowing from the right hand. So some of this is Social Security, but the bigger chunk of it is the Fed. The Fed buys US government debt recently in big numbers. And we'll talk about what the Fed's doing here tomorrow. That's actually going to be one of the things we talk about here over the next couple of days, is the Fed and monetary policy. And we'll talk a lot about how the Fed essentially, as part of doing their business and monetary policy, also does business in US government bond markets. If you're curious as to what the US debt is at this moment, you can always get on the US national debt clock. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever checked this out, but you can see even just from 2019 how much our debt has gone up. I don't know to what extent this is literally accurate, but I mean, this gives you a ballpark figure about where roughly the US national debt is at about $28 billion now, or about $84,000 per person, right? Or about $223,000 per taxpayer. And you can look at US federal revenue, the population, the largest budget items, right? If you want to kind of, if you're one of the kind of people that needs to look at a ticker, right? This kind of shows you the ticker, right? And so it is hard not to look at that $27 billion figure and say, holy crap, that is a lot of money, right? I mean, $27 billion, I mean, it's the kind of number that it's almost impossible for us to put our minds around, right? It's almost impossible for us to put our minds around. So, you know, a lot of people get worried when they see these numbers. And we should talk about whether that worry is justified. And of course, you won't be surprised to find out that I'm going to argue that in many cases it is, and in some cases it's not. So let's talk about the costs or the dangers of public debt. And there's a lot of things here that we could potentially talk about. I'm going to talk at maybe, yeah, we'll introduce this and then maybe we'll take an early break here this morning. Oops. Okay. So when people talk about the dangers of public debt, there's really three things that they're worried about, right? One is when you issue debt, there's an opportunity cost to that. You have to pay interest on it. Right? So there is an opportunity cost of having government debt that, you know, nowadays the government is spending a big chunk of everything that it does on government debt. To put that number into perspective, the government is spending 12% of its spending on interest. This is about as much as we spend on national defense. That's about as much as we spend on national defense. So there's a big opportunity cost to that money, right? What could we do with an extra couple $1 trillion a year? A lot, right? We could do a lot with a couple of $1 trillion a year. And so many people worry about this just simply to say that when we borrow today, we are penalizing future generations in some sense, right? Because we are basically leaving them with debts that they have to pay for. Now, I think the economists would say, well, it's okay to leave them with debt if you also leave them with something valuable, right? So in other words, once again, it gets back to how we spend this money, right? If we borrow today, but we give them better schools, that makes sense. Just like it makes sense for you to borrow to go to college, right? The government can do that on a bigger scale. But if the government's borrowing money and just flushing it down the toilet, on my phone, I have one of these stupid tile things on my keys. Sometimes when I move just right, it always goes off. Sorry about that. But yeah, anyway, it depends what you do with the money, right? But there's no doubt there's a big opportunity cost to this, right? This is a lot of money, right? This is a lot of money that we essentially cannot allocate to other things. Crowding out. We've talked about crowding out before. In fact, you had a question about this on your first exam. Crowding out is the idea that government deficits drive up interest rates. That government deficits drive up interest rates, and as a result, they reduce investment. And this lower investment then hurts long-run growth. So remember we were talking about our loanable funds. Where we had savings, and investments. And let's assume we had a closed economy, right? Let's assume that we have a closed economy. What happens if we have a big increase in the deficit? It reduces total savings, right? And total savings leads to higher interest rates. And it also leads to a reduction in our amount of investment as we move along the investment curve. So notice here that higher interest rates move us along the investment curve and reduce the amount of investment in our economy. And so the worry is that, yeah, if you have bigger deficits, you're going to get less investment in the long run. You're going to get less human capital, physical capital, and research and development because interest rates are high. For the US, though, hold on, get you just 1 second, Jesse. For the US, though, this is not as much as a worry. Why? Because we are an open economy. That we attract a lot of foreign savings from abroad. So ordinarily, this would drive up interest rates in countries. It doesn't in the US so much because we are so able to attract foreign savings from abroad. But for a country like Canada, yeah, this would be a really big issue when it comes to budget deficits. If you run big budget deficits, it's going to start to push up interest rates. Yeah, Jesse.
Why did investment not move up? But why did you move the savings instead of the?
Because savings, why did savings move to the left?
Yeah, because like when you had said, that, with the crowding out, the interest rates being driven up, you said it reduces, investment. So I thought you were about to like, move investments, so that's why
No,
you moved-
it's a movement along our investment curve. So it should be a reduction in quantity of investment, right? So savings goes up, interest rates go up, and that moves us along our investment curve. But notice here, moving us along means having less investment than we did before. But the investment's gone down, not because of some exogenous, or not because of some other factor, it's gone up, it's gone down just simply because interest rates have gone up, the prices. So for the US, crowding out, I mean, you can see it, right? As we're going to talk about here this afternoon, US interest rates are historically low, despite the fact that we have big budget deficits. How do you explain that? Well, this is probably not what's happening in the US because we're not a closed economy. We're an open economy, and the US has relatively little problem attracting a lot of foreign investment, right? This is one of the things, as we're going to see, that makes the US different than most other countries, right? In many ways, the US has a much greater capacity to borrow than almost, and certainly every other country in the world because of a number of advantages that we have. And most of these advantages make the US assets and US dollars look like very attractive places to save for foreigners. And so that's why we don't have high interest rates despite big budget deficits, is because we borrow a lot. The third factor, and this I think I'm just mainly going to say for this afternoon. So let me just say a couple of words about this before I let you go. Is what's called a debt crisis. What's a debt crisis? A debt crisis is when there's a sudden stop in a government's ability to borrow and roll over its debt. A sudden stop in a government's ability to borrow or roll over its debt. So governments that are having deficits, what do they need to be doing? They're always out there issuing new government bonds. They're out there borrowing by issuing new government bonds, right? Both new government bonds to pay for their new deficits, but also they have to roll over their old bonds that they had issued previously. What do I mean by rolled over? Well, some of the bonds that I issued 10 years ago are now coming to maturity. So what does the government have to do? They have to issue new bonds to pay for the old ones, right? This is what governments do, right? They roll over their old debt. So governments are borrowing new, but they're also paying off some of their old debt as they go along. But what happens when markets lose confidence? Markets stop buying your debt, the government's debt. And what happens when they stop buying your government's debt? Now the government can't borrow, right? Now they can't borrow. And so what do you tend to see? Huge increases in interest rates. Governments can't borrow, so they can't spend. What's going to happen both for domestic citizens and foreign citizens? They're probably going to start to unload and try to get out of your country. So you're likely to see your bond market collapse, your stock market collapse as investors freak out, right? You are likely to see some sort of financial crisis. Such as banks fail. Who holds a lot of government debt? I guess I haven't made this clear. When I said the public holds 50% of US government debt, who is a lot of that public? A lot of that public is banks. Banks hold a lot of US government debt. So, whether we're talking about Greece or the United States, if Greece defaults on its debt, who gets stuck the most? Greek banks. Greek banks are going to be in danger of failing if the Greek government doesn't pay back its bonds. This and a whole bunch of other things that we'll maybe talk about a little bit later. But the key here is that these are all going to reduce the aggregate demand, lead to a huge recession. This is no bueno, right? Having a debt crisis is not good, right? It is not a good thing. And so where I want to pick up here this afternoon when we come back on Zoom is talk through this, right? What do you do if you have a debt crisis, right? What's the options? How does a country recover from this? I want to talk a little bit about the Greek debt crisis because that's been in the news here the last decade or so. It's kind of interesting to talk about that as a way of kind of seeing how debt crises work. And then I want to talk a little bit about the future of the US budget. And specifically, is the US going to have a debt crisis like this in the future, right? And I'll make the argument that the US is a little different. But so that's where we'll pick up this afternoon. So I don't think it'll be a particularly long class this afternoon. Maybe we'll meet for about 45 minutes or an hour, okay, on Zoom. So, all right. Yeah, so enjoy your extra couple minutes here of lunch and meet you all back on Zoom at 12:30.